Charlie Hodge couldn't sleep. It was 2:17 in the morning on August 14th, 1977, and something had woken him in his room on the second floor of Graceland. He lay in bed listening. Then he heard it. Piano music, faint but unmistakable, drifting up from downstairs. And someone was singing. Elvis. Charlie had been working with Elvis for nearly 2 decades, first as a backup singer, then as his closest friend. He knew Elvis's voice better than his own, but this was different. This wasn't practice or performance. This was something else entirely, something Charlie had never heard before in all their years together. He got out of bed and walked quietly to his door. The music was coming from the music room downstairs. The melody was haunting and unfamiliar, not one of Elvis's hits, not a gospel standard, and the lyrics seemed to be about endings and goodbyes and running out of time. Charlie felt a chill. Something about the way Elvis was singing, about the words he was using, felt like a premonition, like Elvis was singing his own eulogy. Charlie made his way downstairs quietly. He didn't want to interrupt whatever was happening. When he reached the first floor, he could hear the music clearly. Elvis was at the piano, playing and singing with an intensity Charlie hadn't heard from him in months, maybe years. The song was slow and melancholic, built around a simple but beautiful chord progression. Elvis's voice, damaged by years of medications, still carried emotional weight that made Charlie's throat tighten. He was singing about looking back on a life lived, about mistakes made and chances missed, about loving people and leaving them behind. Charlie stood in the hallway outside the music room, not entering. Through the partially open door, he could see Elvis sitting at the piano in dim light from a single lamp. He was wearing a robe over pajamas, his face puffy from medications. He looked tired and old and sick, but his hands on the piano keys were sure. The song continued for several minutes, Elvis working through verses and a chorus, occasionally stopping to adjust a chord. He seemed to be composing in real time. Charlie recognized this as significant. Elvis hadn't written much original material in years. For Elvis to be composing something now, at 2 in the morning, less than 48 hours before he would be found dead, felt like a final creative act. The lyrics Charlie heard that night would haunt him for the rest of his life. Elvis sang about feeling his time running out, about knowing something was ending. He sang about his mother, dead for 19 years but still feeling closer than the living people around him. He sang about wanting to go home, but not being sure where home was anymore. Elvis sang about fame being a beautiful lie, about becoming so famous that he stopped being real even to himself. He sang about looking in the mirror and not recognizing the person looking back. He sang about the pills that were supposed to help but only made everything worse. He sang about his daughter Lisa Marie and hoping she'd remember him as something more than the broken man he'd become. The most chilling part was when Elvis sang about being ready. Ready for what, he didn't specify. But the word carried weight, carried finality. It sounded like a man preparing to leave. Charlie stood frozen in that hallway, tears streaming down his face, listening to his best friend compose what sounded like a farewell. Part of him wanted to burst into the room to stop Elvis from singing these terrible prophetic lyrics. But another part of Charlie, the part that had watched Elvis's slow decline, knew better. These weren't just sad lyrics. This was the truth. Elvis was dying, and somewhere deep inside, he knew it. The song continued for perhaps 20 minutes in total. Elvis would play through a section, then stop and rework it, play it again with changes. He was crafting something, treating it with the care he used to give to his gospel recordings. At one point, Elvis stopped playing entirely and sat with his hands resting on the keys, his head bowed. Then he started speaking quietly. "Mama, I'm so tired. I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this. Every day feels heavier than the last. The pills don't work anymore. Nothing works anymore. I just want to rest." Charlie wanted to go to him to comfort him, but something kept him rooted in place. This felt private, sacred. To interrupt would be to violate something important. Elvis started playing again, but this time he was playing old gospel hymns, the songs his mother had taught him. His voice was softer now, almost a whisper. Charlie finally stepped away from the door and made his way back upstairs to his room. He lay in bed listening to the gospel music drifting up from below, and he cried. He cried because he knew somehow that he was listening to the last songs Elvis would ever sing. When Charlie came down for breakfast on August 14th, Elvis was already up, sitting at the kitchen table eating and talking with his girlfriend, Ginger Alden. He looked tired but was in good spirits, joking and making plans for the tour starting in a few days. Charlie studied his face, looking for signs of the broken man he'd heard singing at 2 in the morning. But Elvis was performing again, wearing the mask he'd perfected over decades. Charlie wanted to mention the song, wanted to ask Elvis about what he'd been working on, but something stopped him. The song had felt private, meant only for Elvis himself. To bring it up might embarrass Elvis or force him to put up even more walls. So Charlie said nothing. The day passed normally. Elvis made phone calls, dealt with business matters, spent time with Lisa Marie, who was visiting. He seemed fine. That evening, Elvis went upstairs to his bedroom around 10:30. Charlie went to bed around the same time. 48 hours after Charlie had heard Elvis composing that final song, on August 16, 1977, around 2:30 in the afternoon, Ginger Alden found Elvis Presley dead on his bathroom floor. He was 42 years old. The official cause of death was cardiac arrhythmia, but everyone who knew him understood the real cause was years of prescription drug abuse and the slow suicide of a man who'd lost the ability to cope with being Elvis Presley. When Charlie heard the news, the first thing he thought about was that song, the midnight composition, the prophetic lyrics about time running out and being ready and going home. Elvis had known, maybe not consciously, maybe not in a way he could articulate, but somewhere deep inside, he'd known his time was almost over, and he'd written a song about it. In the chaos that followed Elvis's death, the funeral arrangements, the media frenzy, the grief and shock that consumed everyone who'd loved him, Charlie forgot to mention the song. It wasn't until weeks later, after Elvis had been buried in the meditation garden at Graceland, after the crowds of mourners had dispersed, that Charlie remembered and went looking for it. He searched the music room where Elvis had been playing that night. He looked through the piano bench, through the stacks of sheet music, through Elvis's notebooks where he sometimes jotted down lyrics or musical ideas. He found nothing. No sheet music, no written lyrics, no recording, no evidence that the song had ever existed, except in Charlie's memory and in the midnight air of Graceland on August 14, 1977. Charlie asked the other members of Elvis's inner circle if anyone else had heard Elvis working on a new song in those final days. Nobody had. He was the only witness to what might have been Elvis's final original composition, the last thing Elvis had created before his death. And because he hadn't recorded it, because Elvis hadn't written it down, because Charlie had only heard it once from 2 floors up and then from a hallway, the song was lost forever. Charlie could remember fragments, the melody, or parts of it, certain phrases from the lyrics, the overall feeling of melancholy and farewell. But he couldn't reconstruct the whole thing, couldn't recreate what Elvis had created that night. He tried, sitting at that same piano in the music room at Graceland, trying to find the chord progression, trying to remember exactly how the melody went. But it was like trying to remember a dream. The harder he tried to grasp it, the more it slipped away. For years after Elvis's death, Charlie was haunted by that lost song. He would wake up in the middle of the night sometimes, certain he could hear Elvis singing it again, only to realize it was just a dream or a memory playing tricks on him. He would be listening to music and hear something that reminded him of that melody, and he'd try to follow the thread back to the original, but he could never quite get there. In interviews over the years, Charlie occasionally mentioned the incident, though he was always vague about details. He'd say that Elvis had been working on something new in his final days, something original and deeply personal, but he could never recreate it, could never give people more than the impression of what it had been. Some people thought Charlie was misremembering, that grief and time had created a false memory of something that never truly existed. Others believed him, but assumed the song couldn't have been as significant as Charlie claimed, that loss and nostalgia had elevated a simple midnight composition into something mythical. But Charlie knew the truth. He'd heard it. He'd stood in that hallway at Graceland and listened to Elvis Presley, in the last days of his life, create one final piece of music that was purely his own. Not something created for commercial success, not something designed to please Colonel Parker or RCA Records or the millions of fans, just music created for its own sake, for the sake of expressing something that needed to be expressed before it was too late. The loss of that song became symbolic of everything else that was lost when Elvis died. All the music he might have created if he'd lived, all the growth and evolution he might have experienced as an artist, all the peace and happiness he might have found if he'd been able to escape the trap of fame and addiction. The lost song was all of Elvis's unrealized potential, all his unlived life, compressed into a single melody that played once and disappeared forever. Charlie Hodge lived until 2006, nearly 30 years after Elvis's death. He never stopped thinking about that song. In his final years, when interviewers asked him about his time with Elvis, about his favorite memories or most significant moments, Charlie would always come back to that midnight in August when he'd heard his friend singing goodbye. "People ask me about the big moments," Charlie said in one of his last interviews. "The concerts, the movies, the famous songs, but the moment that stays with me is the one nobody else witnessed. Just Elvis and a piano and a song nobody will ever hear again. That's when I saw him most clearly, not as the king of rock and roll, but as an artist trying to make sense of his life before it ended." Today, the story of Elvis's lost final song has become part of the mythology surrounding his death. Some people doubt it existed at all, thinking Charlie's grief created or exaggerated the memory. Others believe it was real, but see it as simply another sad detail in the tragic end of Elvis's life. A few music historians have tried to recreate what the song might have sounded like based on Charlie's fragmentary descriptions, but these attempts are speculative at best. The truth is that the song is gone, as lost as Elvis himself. Whatever he was trying to express in those midnight hours on August 14th, 1977, whatever final statement he was making about his life and his approaching death, died with him 48 hours later. The song exists now only in Charlie Hodge's fading memory and in the imagination of those who wish they could have heard it. But maybe that's fitting. Maybe some artistic expressions aren't meant to be preserved and analyzed and picked apart. Maybe some songs are meant to exist for a moment and then disappear, leaving behind only the memory of their existence. Elvis spent his entire adult life having his every word and action recorded, analyzed, bought, and sold. Maybe that final song, the one he composed for himself in the darkness of his final days, needed to remain private and ephemeral, a piece of art that belonged only to its creator and the one friend who stood in a hallway and listened. Or maybe the loss is tragedy compounded on tragedy. A final masterpiece that could have been, should have been, but wasn't captured for posterity. One more thing the world lost when it lost Elvis Presley. One more reminder that talent and genius don't protect you from pain and mortality. One more example of potential unfulfilled, of promises broken, of music silenced too soon before it could be shared with the world that had loved him for so long. Charlie Hodge took the memory of that song to his grave in 2006. He's buried not far from Elvis at Forest Hill Cemetery, and sometimes visitors to the area leave flowers on both graves. The two friends, separated by nearly 3 decades, but connected forever by that midnight moment when one sang and the other listened, when one said goodbye and the other bore witness to a farewell nobody else would ever hear. The song Elvis wrote in his final hours remains lost, probably forever, but its absence speaks as loudly as its presence might have. It reminds us that for all we know about Elvis Presley, for all the recordings and films and photographs and testimonies that document his life, there was always more to him than what was captured and preserved. There was always an inner life that remained private, always thoughts and feelings and creative impulses that never made it into the public record. Elvis Presley died at 42, far too young, leaving behind a complicated legacy of revolutionary music and tragic decline. But somewhere, in those final hours, in the darkness of Graceland at 2 a.m, he created one more piece of art, one final song that expressed something true and essential about who he was and what he felt as his time ran out. The fact that we'll never hear it doesn't make it less real. If anything, It makes it more precious, a reminder that not everything can be commodified and sold, that some moments of artistic truth belong only to their creator and the darkness that witnessed their birth. 48 hours after Elvis sang that final song, he was gone, and the song went with him, lost to time and memory, leaving behind only the testimony of one friend who stood in a hallway and listened and wept and remembered.